Hi, this is Andrea Kane, and I'm here with you for HIT 120 Pharmacology. Welcome to week 1. If you take a look at your syllabus, you see that we are not in any part of our textbook this week. We are just going to be covering some basic information this week and next week. Our course objectives are 8.1, 8.2 if you look at the syllabus. And really, we're going to use the same unit objectives week 1 and week 2, which are 9.1.1 through 9.1.10 and 9.2.1 through 9.2.13. And we'll just spread them out between these first couple of weeks. So this is our video lecture. When we start off talking about drugs, what we really mean by that are medicines and substances that are used to prevent or treat a condition or disease. This information, as you can see at the bottom, is being pulled from Chapter 21 in The Language of Medicine by Davie Ellen Chabner. It is a medical terminology textbook. If you happen to be in my class in fall of 2020, that's the book we used. We did cover briefly Chapter 21, but we're going to start out with it here because it's such a good basis, a good broad basis. If you don't have that book, you are welcome to take a look at the website, Brightspace, and go into course materials, and there should be a zip file in there with, not course materials, week 1. If you look at week 1, there is a zip file that's labeled pages from HSC 114, chapter 21. And that's where you can look at the actual pages from the textbook that I've put in there for your reference. So getting back to that, if you want to follow along, you can take a look at those pages through that zip file that you've downloaded, or you can go ahead and follow along here, because this does have most of that information, or you can pull out your medical terminology textbook and follow along. Drugs and medicines and substances, those words sort of are interchangeable somewhat. They're obtained from various sources. They can come from plants, and there's a wide variety of plants and trees and tree bark and all sorts of things from nature that they have found that have substances in them that can be used medically. Honey, for example, is one that they found that works really well as an antiseptic. And there's different types of oils that come from things and all of that. So plant-based, tree-based, animal-based. With some animals, they've utilized them for hormones. And when we get to the endocrine chapter, we will talk about that. And then others are synthesized in a lab. Essentially, they're made up in a lab. They use different compounds, they've done testing, and they've just created them. They're not plant-based, they're not animal-based. They're simply made in a lab. Some pharmacology professionals and subspecialty areas in pharmacology that you need to be aware of and be knowledgeable about are on this slide and the next one. The two professionals that you'll probably run into the most with pharmacology are pharmacists. They have a degree that's called PharmD, and pharmacologists, which are MDs or PhDs. The subspecialties you'll find in pharmacology are medicinal chemistry, molecular pharmacology, chemotherapy, and toxicology. You'll also hear about those who specialize in pharmacodynamics or pharmacokinetics. And the definitions for all of these are here on these slides, but I would take a look at those pages in the medical terminology textbook. In fact, let me pull those page numbers for you, so that you've got those handy as we go through here. This is all on page 824, where they define what are these different types, subdivisions, or specialties in pharmacology. Pharmacodynamics looks at the drug's effects in the body. How does it impact the body? Pharmacokinetics, on the other hand, looks at how the drug is absorbed, distributed, metabolized, and then excreted. All right, pop quiz right out of the gate. Which term means below the skin? If you took medical terminology recently, you should ace this. Below, look for the prefix that means below or under, and you'll want to and that should clue you in. There's my hint for you. All right, drug names, standards, and references. Every drug has three names. Did you know that? They have three names. The first one is their chemical name. That's the exact chemical makeup of that drug, of that substance. It also has a generic name. That's the legal and scientific name of that drug. And then it has a brand name. The drug manufacturer usually trademarks it under a brand name in order for marketing and to sell, and because for the first 7 years they have an exclusive right to produce that drug, and after the 7-year mark is up, anyone can produce it under their own brand name or under and everybody knows it as the generic name. So an example might be ibuprofen. Ibuprofen is a generic name, and there are brand names for ibuprofen like Motrin, Advil, those types of things. So that's just an example. And it talks about chemical, generic, and brand names at the top of page 825. Let's talk about some differences between prescription and over-the-counter drugs. Prescription drugs are prescribed by a doctor, typically bought at a pharmacy. You could go to a store like a Walmart or a Target, that sort of thing, but they have a pharmacy within that store. You're actually purchasing it from the pharmacy, not the store shelves. It's prescribed for and intended to be used by one specific person, one specifically identifiable person. Whereas if you talk about over-the-counter drugs, they don't require a doctor's prescription. You buy them right off the shelf in any store that stocks them. And they are not necessarily for one specific individual. For instance, if you buy Benadryl because you have kids with allergies, multiple kids can use the same bottle of Benadryl until you run out. So that's an example of how it's different. But both prescription and over-the-counter medications are regulated by the FDA. So both of them are regulated through the FDA. Have you ever heard the term designer drug or orphan drug and wondered what that was about? Typically, and it shows here that the Orphan Drug Act came in 1983, but prior to that, most drugs were designed for a broad spectrum of people and to treat conditions that affected many, many, many people. And that was the way that things were done. And so those with rare diseases, medications typically weren't developed for rare diseases until a certain number of people had them or that type of thing. But in 1983, the U.S. enacted the Orphan Drug Act. And as you can see from this information that I've pulled for you from an article from the scientists, orphan drugs really became a thing, orphan or designer drugs. Before that law passed, there were only 10 that had entered the market. And now there's more than 450 products for 668 orphan conditions or rare conditions. So you went from 10 to more than 450 just in that, 30-year time frame, 35-year time frame. The EU passed a similar policy in 2000, and they created incentives for pharmaceutical companies because there's quite a few that are based in Europe. And normally people might not be willing to invest because the drug only benefits a tiny patient population. But because of these policies and these drug acts, it reduced the regulatory fees, it made it easier for clinical trials and all sorts of things, and so it took off. And as you can see, as we go further through these bullet points, 41% of the products green-lighted by the FDA in 2014 had orphan designation. That means that only 59% of the products that were green-lighted by the FDA in 2014 were for major populations, people that had very common illnesses or diseases. The rest of these are targeting very rare conditions with minimal populations. So it talks about how orphan drug companies have had a higher return on investment than non-orphan drug companies, and so that's why this has become so popular. And again, I like this quote in the last paragraph about how with rare conditions, it's easier to find a pharmacological target in an effective drug. When you're talking about a rare disease, it's very specific. When you're talking about something that's much broader, like COPD or influenza or congestive heart failure, those are such broad categories, and they have so many different aspects to them that get involved. Whereas if you're talking about something very specific, very narrow, like say cystic fibrosis, you have something that's much more easy to target. So orphan drugs are a very positive positive change for those who have rare diseases, and the growth of those medications have been very beneficial. On the other hand, you can see where pharmaceutical companies have turned away from looking at broader-based type drugs, medications for broader-based conditions, and are really now looking at those niche markets for those orphan drugs. So it's both good and a challenge, but we wanted you to understand what a designer orphan drug is. Spelling of drug names. You can look at a drug name and it will give you hints about the drug's purpose. And these are two links that you can click on and go out to, and or you can copy them and put them in your browser and go take a look about how, if the last name is Cillin or OLOL, some of those, how that keys you into what the drug is. Now, it's not perfect because, of course, like the English language, the rules change and there are exceptions, but there are some that will clue you in on that. So, and encourage you to take a look at both of these. There are some drug standards preferences that we want you to be aware of. There's the Food and Drug Administration, which is the FDA. They're the ones that look at prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs, those types of things. The United States Pharmacopedia, that's where you can look at all the information about the drugs. It reviews what's available commercially and looks at their effectiveness in specific medical conditions. So that one is really helpful to know about. Hospitals and insurance companies have drug formularies, and that basically is a list of medications that are approved to be utilized under that situation, and they do it both for cost as well as appropriate stocking and things like that. There's several things behind that. This is at the bottom of page 825, and then they want to make you aware of a long-standing drug reference book called the Physician's Desk Reference, or PDR. That's been around for at least 50 years, probably longer, and it's a very thick book. If you get your hands on it in paper, I would say it's probably 4 to 5, maybe 6 inches thick now. It has some great information about drugs. Administration and form of drugs. Well, drugs come in different forms. They come in capsules, they come in pills, they come in suppositories, they come in liquid, they come in injectable form, they come in a form that's been put into some type of a solution. They come in a patch. They come in an inhaler. They come in, and you can see they come in a dissolvable that you put underneath your tongue. Basically, any administration route equals a type of drug, and sometimes they're multiple, as I point out, between like a capsule versus a tablet versus, that sort of thing, a liquid. So what are those administration routes? Well, it's orally through the mouth, sublingual under the tongue, rectal through the anus, parenteral, And there's all these kinds of injections. There's intracavity, intradermal, intramuscular, intrathecal, intravenous, and subcutaneous. That there are all of those. And I want to point out something really quick because I just noticed it on this slide. This is an incorrect abbreviation. It should be SQ for sub-Q, not SC. Anyway, so inhalation, you breathe it in. Topical, you put it on the skin. But back to parenteral, that's an injection. If you see the word parenteral, you want to be thinking injection. It's going to get injected in somewhere. So those are the administration routes. And so, of course, the forms of drugs follow those. Terminology of drug action. This is on page 828 in your book. It has some really good definitions for here, and I'll go ahead and read them as we go through. A receptor is a target of a drug. So when a drug enters the body, it produces its effect by interacting with a specific target or receptor. The drug may cross the cell membrane to reach its intracellular receptor, or it may react with a receptor on the cell's surface. The dose of a drug is the amount of drug administered, usually measured in milligrams or grams. Schedule is the exact timing and frequency of drug administration, but schedule, as you'll also see, has to do with whether or not it's a narcotic. So watch out for the word schedule, because schedule can mean exact timing and frequency of the drug administration, and schedule can also mean the level of narcotic that it is. So just be careful with that. Various actions and interactions of drugs can occur after they have been absorbed into the bloodstream. And this is really what we'll be covering week 3. We will spend a good amount of time in week 3 on receptor theory, absorption, distribution, clearance, all of that. The metabolism of drug, how it's eliminated through your renal system, and all of that. So that's week 3. But what you really, really need to know for this week, for your quiz, hint, 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 is additive action, antagonistic versus synergistic. What is synergism? Response, tolerance, addiction, dependence, controlled substances. Those words, those concepts. So let's talk about how drugs interact in the body. And you're talking about when you're giving 2 drugs. You may not give them at the same time. You may not give them in the same route or the same way, but a patient who is on 2 drugs. Additive action. If the combination of 2 similar drugs is equal to the sum of the effects of each, then the drugs are called additive. So what this means is if drug A gives a 10% tumor kill rate as a chemotherapeutic agent, and drug B gives a 20% tumor kill rate, using A and B together would give you a 30% tumor kill rate. That is additive action. You're adding the 10% of drug A to the 20% of drug B. You're getting 30% tumor kill rate. That's additive action. Antagonistic is when those 2 drugs are given, again, the 10% A, the 20% B, but the reaction is less than the additive action, meaning, okay, you give agent A, you give agent B, you're expecting to get 30% tumor kill rate because that's your additive action, but you only get a 15% or a 20% or a 25% tumor kill rate. It's less than that 30%. That's antagonistic. If by chance, though, you give those 2 drugs and you've got the 10% for drug A, 20% for drug B for the tumor kill rate, but when you go to take a look, you see you've got a 40 or 50% tumor kill rate, that's synergistic. Okay, so additive action is the sum, antagonistic is less than the sum, synergistic is more than the sum. So keep that in mind. So additive action is just the sum. It's like an equal sign. Antagonistic is less than, so be thinking the less than sign. Synergistic is the greater than sign. Oh, you've got greater than that additive action. Okay, so moving on, response is the desired beneficial effect of a drug. Tolerance. For some drugs, the effect of a given dose diminishes as treatment continues, and increasing amounts are needed to produce the same effect. Tolerance is one of the challenges with opioid and narcotic medications, that over time, someone's tolerance impacts it so that they either perceive that they're getting the same effect, they're getting less than what they were before, or they actually are, either one. And so then you start trying to use increasing amounts, whether that's an individual's choice because of their perception, or whether that's actuality, that the physician is noting that, the patient's noting that, and they decide together, ooh, we're going to have to raise this dose. Tolerance is a feature of addiction to drugs such as morphine and like Demerol. Demerol is a narcotic. So when you're talking about narcotics, which we will as we go through here, tolerance is a feature of addiction. Addiction is the physical and psychological dependence on and craving for a drug and the presence of clearly unpleasant effects when that drug or other agent, such as a narcotic, is stopped. So again, I'm going to read that again. Addiction is the physical and psychological dependence on and craving for a drug and the presence of clearly unpleasant effects when that drug or other agent, such as a narcotic, is stopped. Controlled substances are drugs such as opioids and or narcotics that produce dependence and have potential for abuse or addiction. And if you look at pages 848 and 849, you'll see there's some information about those drugs there. And we will spend some time talking about narcotics, including opioids. So let's move on. Quick quiz. The combination of two drugs is greater than the total effects of each drug by itself. We talked about this. Is it equal to? Is it more than? Is it less than? Is it one of those where over time increasing amounts are needed to produce the same effect? And idiosyncrasy. Now is a good time for me to talk about this. Okay, so it says drug toxicity is an unpleasant and potentially dangerous effect of a drug. Idiosyncrasy is an example of an unpredictable type of drug toxicity. This is any unexpected and uncommon side effect that develops after administration of a drug. So they're giving you the example that idiosyncrasy is like anaphylaxis. They have this sudden reaction that's totally unexpected. So that should help you answer this one. All right, drug toxicity, I just read through that. I covered idiosyncrasy. Iatrogenic, that term means it's produced by the treatment. It just happens because of the treatment. The treatment occurred and it happens. It can be a result of mistakes in drug use or because of an individual's sensitivity. It's not necessarily known in advance. Again, it can just happen. But what this word iatrogenic does is it refers back to the fact that whatever happened because the person was taking that treatment. Then you have side effects. These are unpleasant effects that routinely result from the use of a drug. They often occur with the usual therapeutic dose of a drug and are generally tolerable and reversible when the drug is discontinued. Contraindications are factors in a patient's condition that make the use of a particular drug dangerous and ill-advised. So, for instance, contraindications means that because of the patient's current health or their allergies or their situation, they can't have that happen. So you can even be talking about a surgical procedure that it's contraindicated because, and then you give the reason. Drug resistance. This is the loss of the effectiveness of a drug. It's seen when drugs are unable to control the disease process in a particular patient. A good example of this is antibiotic resistance. Someone's developed a resistance to a particular antibiotic. That can be happen. So it can be a genetic change in the disease. For whatever reason, the effectiveness of the drug is reduced. That's the resistance. So now we get into classes of drugs, and we're going to be going through all of these in subsequent weeks. All I really want you to know here is these titles and what they are and how you spell them. And this starts in your book on page 829 with analgesics. Analgesics have to do with pain. So if your analgesia or analgesics is the sensitivity to pain. So analgesics are to treat pain, to lessen pain. Anesthetics, that is an agent that reduces or eliminates sensation. Anesthetics are used with surgery or some type of procedure that's going to cause pain. Antibiotics and other antimicrobials and antivirals, those are to kill or inhibit the growth of microorganisms of one form or another. Anticoagulants and antiplatelet drugs, these anticoagulants prevent clotting. And then, of course, you've got your antiplatelets that reduce the tendency of the platelets to stick together and clot. Anticonvulsants. These prevent or reduce the frequency of convulsions in various types of seizure disorders, which includes epilepsy. They are also commonly used with chronic nerve pain and also quite a few mental health illnesses such as bipolar disorder and anxiety. Antidepressants and anti-Alzheimer's drugs, these treat symptoms of depression, elevate mood, increase physical activity and mental alertness. And then anti-Alzheimer drug used to treat the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease and act by aiding brain neurotransmitters or shielding brain cells from glutamate, which is a neurotransmitter that gets too high and kills brain cells. Anti-diabetics, these are used to treat diabetes mellitus, and they essentially are a form of insulin in many ways. So we'll get into that. But antihistamines, these block the action of histamine, which is normally released in the body in allergic reactions. Anti-osteoporosis drugs. Osteoporosis, as many of us are probably familiar with in a family member, is marked by a loss of bone density. So anti-osteoporosis drugs try to increase calcium deposit in bone. Cardiovascular drugs. This is a huge type. I mean, there's so many, and there's another slide on this. So let me run forward for that. There are ACE inhibitors, there are antiarrhythmics, there are beta blockers, there's calcium channel blockers, cholesterol lowering drugs, diuretics. You just have all of these. So we'll be covering those, but they basically act on the heart or the blood vessels. Going back here, we have endocrine. And I'm not sure if we have a slide. Yes, we do have a slide on endocrine. Endocrine is another huge category. It includes androgens, anti-androgens, estrogens, anti-estrogens, SERMs, which are selective estrogen receptor modulators, progestins, thyroid hormones, glucocorticoids. So there's a huge category there we will definitely be covering. Gastrointestinal drugs are used to relieve uncomfortable, potentially dangerous symptoms. They don't cure, they're just there to manage the symptoms. And Let's see, do we have a slide? Yes. Antacids, anti-ulcer, which are histamine receptor blockers. Look at that. Histamine is involved here. Antidiarrheal, cathartics, which are laxatives or purgatives, anti-nauseants or antiemetics. So watch out for this. Antiemetic means it's against nausea. So it tries to prevent nausea and vomiting. Laxatives or purgatives, that's to evacuate the colon, shall we say. Antidiarrheal, that is to slow down the colon. And then you've got your anti-ulcer, which can also include stomach acid reduction and things like that with those antacids. Oh, let me go back. Okay, so we talked about cardiovascular, endocrine, and gastrointestinal. We're also going to be covering respiratory drugs, those inhalers for asthma and COPD. We'll be talking about sedatives and hypnotics. These are medications that depress the CNS system, central nervous system, and promote drowsiness and sleep. They are often prescribed for insomnia and sleep disorders. There are stimulants. These are drugs that act on the brain to speed up vital processes in the heart and respiration in cases of shock and collapse, but they also increase alertness and inhibit hyperactive behavior in children. Although high doses can produce restlessness, insomnia, and hypertension. And they give caffeine as an example here. As someone who drinks quite a bit of caffeine every day, I hate to say it, but it's a stimulant I'm not ready to give up. Tranquilizers. These are useful for controlling anxiety. And notice the difference between a tranquilizer and a sedative. There is a big difference there. Promoting drowsiness is different than controlling anxiety, so make sure you keep those two separate in your mind. And we'll talk about major and minor tranquilizers when we get to that section. So let's move ahead to our vocabulary. These are terms that you need to know, both how to spell and what the meaning is for your quiz this week. Hint, hint, hint. So there's addiction, additive action, aerosol, anaphylaxis, antagonistic action, antidote, brand name, chemical name, contraindications, controlled substances, dependence, dose, FDA, generic name, iatrogenic, idiosyncratic reaction, inhalation, medicinal chemistry, molecular pharmacology, oral administration, parenteral administration, pharmacist, pharmacy, pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics, pharmacologist, pharmacology, physician's desk reference or PDR, receptor, rectal administration, resistance, response, schedule, side effect, sublingual administration, synergism, syringe, tolerance, topical application, toxicity, toxicology, transport, United States pharmacopoeia, vitamin, and a quick quiz question. I think this is our last one. Which term means preventing nausea and vomiting? Sorry, my mouse gets a little excited. Which is against or preventing nausea and vomiting. We covered this, so I know you can get it. All right, so the last 3 slides here are what I want you to know for your quiz. Hint, 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 hint. I'm trying to help you know what exactly to study. So I put these questions in here, and I want you to go through those and study those to be prepared for your quiz. All right? Have a great week, and I will be back to talk to you about week 2 in a little bit, but in the meantime, have a great week 1. Take care.